In the summer of 1858, London became almost impossible to breathe in. The River Thames, the river running directly through the heart of the largest city in the world, had become a massive open sewer. Human waste, animal carcasses, industrial chemicals, rotting food, and the contents of countless cesspits had been pouring into it for years. Then the weather turned hot. The water level dropped. The sewage along the riverbanks began baking in the sun, and a smell so overwhelming rolled across London that people became physically sick just standing near the river. Inside the Houses of Parliament, curtains were soaked in chemicals in a desperate attempt to block the stench. It did not work. And Parliament finally confronted a problem humanity had been creating for thousands of years. What do you do with human waste when millions of people live together? The answer would eventually involve enormous underground tunnels, epidemics, engineers, scientists, plumbers, billions of gallons of water, and one invention so ordinary that most of us use it several times a day without giving it a second thought: the toilet. Today, you walk into a bathroom, push a button or pull a handle, and everything disappears. That tiny action represents thousands of years of engineering, and it has probably saved more lives than almost any object in your home. But the story of the toilet does not begin in Victorian London. It begins thousands of years earlier, when humans first made a decision that created an entirely new problem. They stopped moving. For most of human prehistory, sanitation was relatively simple. Small groups of hunter-gatherers moved constantly. Human waste could be deposited away from camp and abandoned. Nature had space and time to break it down. Then agriculture changed everything. Around 10,000 years ago, humans began building permanent settlements. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. And suddenly thousands of people were eating, sleeping, drinking, and defecating in the same place every day. Human civilization had invented the sanitation crisis. Some of the earliest known solutions appeared in ancient Mesopotamia. By roughly 4000 BC, communities there were using clay pipes to move waste and wastewater away from inhabited areas. But some ancient civilizations went much further. More than 4,000 years ago, cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, including Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, developed remarkably sophisticated drainage systems. Homes could contain washing areas and toilets connected to covered brick drains running beneath streets. Wastewater was directed away from living spaces through networks that required planning across entire neighborhoods. Think about what that means. Thousands of years before electricity, engines, or modern medicine, urban planners had already understood one of the fundamental rules of civilization. If people are going to live close together, their waste has to go somewhere else. Other civilizations arrived at their own solutions. Ancient Egyptians used simple toilet seats placed over containers filled with sand. The Greeks constructed drainage channels. And then the Romans took sanitation and made it enormous. Ancient Rome was obsessed with water. Aqueducts carried huge quantities of fresh water into the city from distant springs and mountains. Public fountains supplied neighborhoods. Bathhouses became centers of Roman social life. And beneath the streets ran sewers. The most famous was the Cloaca Maxima, an enormous drainage system whose origins stretched back centuries before the Roman Empire reached its height. Public latrines became common features of Roman cities, and they were very public. Imagine a stone room with a long bench running along the walls. Cut into that bench were rows of holes. No stalls, no doors, no privacy. People sat next to one another while discussing business, politics, gossip, or whatever else Romans discussed while using the toilet. Running water beneath the seats carried waste away. Another shallow channel supplied water used for cleaning. To a modern person, the experience would have been horrifyingly intimate. But compared with throwing waste into the street, it was an extraordinary piece of urban infrastructure. The Romans had something approaching a sanitation system. And then much of Western Europe lost it. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, cities shrank, aqueducts deteriorated, public infrastructure broke down, and the enormous administrative systems required to maintain Roman sanitation disappeared with them. Europe did not suddenly forget what waste was. It simply lost much of the infrastructure needed to manage it at scale. And what followed was messy. Medieval castles often used garderobes, small rooms projecting from exterior walls where waste dropped through a vertical shaft into a pit, moat, or the ground below. In towns, chamber pots became part of everyday life. You used the pot, then you had to empty it, sometimes into a cesspit, sometimes into a drain, and sometimes into the street. This created exactly the problem you would expect. As European cities grew, enormous quantities of human waste accumulated in spaces never designed to handle them. Cesspits filled beneath houses. Waste seeped into soil. Wells could become contaminated. Streets mixed mud, animal manure, household garbage, and human sewage into something no modern tourism board would put on a brochure. And yet for centuries, this was normal urban life. There were workers whose job was to deal with it. In England, they became known as night soil men or nightmen because much of the work was performed after dark. They climbed into cesspits and removed human waste by hand, hauling it away for disposal or sometimes selling it as fertilizer. It was filthy, dangerous work, but without them, cities would have drowned in their own waste. The problem was becoming increasingly obvious. The solution was not. Then, in 1596, an English courtier named Sir John Harington built something unusual. Harington was a writer, inventor, and godson of Queen Elizabeth I, and he designed a device with a raised cistern that released water into a bowl, washing the contents away. In other words, a flushing toilet. He even wrote a book describing it. One was reportedly installed for the Queen, and then almost nothing happened. The world was not ready. Harrington's device was expensive, water supplies were limited, sewer infrastructure barely existed, and most people had no reason to install a machine that simply moved waste from one inconvenient place to another. This is one of the strangest patterns in the history of technology. Sometimes an invention appears before the system needed to make it useful. The flushing toilet was one of those inventions. For nearly 2 centuries, the basic idea waited. Then came the Industrial Revolution. Cities exploded. London's population grew at extraordinary speed. Factories pulled hundreds of thousands of people into dense neighborhoods. Houses were packed together. Poor families crowded into tiny rooms. And underneath many of those buildings sat cesspits. More people meant more waste. More waste meant fuller cesspits. And fuller cesspits meant an increasingly unbearable city. Then, in 1775, Scottish inventor Alexander Cumming patented an improvement that changed the toilet permanently. The important part was not simply the flush, it was the bend in the pipe. Cumming designed an S-shaped trap that retained a small amount of water after each flush. That water created a barrier between the room and the sewer below. Without it, sewer gases could travel straight back through the pipe and into the house. It sounds ridiculously simple, a curved pipe containing a little water, but that small bend helped make indoor sanitation practical. 3 years later, inventor Joseph Bazalgette improved the design further, creating a more reliable flushing mechanism. Gradually, water closets began appearing in wealthy British homes. At first, they were luxury technology. Then they became fashionable, and that created a new problem. Because Victorian London had begun installing toilets faster than it was building somewhere for all that waste to go. Flush toilets did not destroy sewage. They moved it, and increasingly, they moved it into London's drains and rivers. The technology was working exactly as intended. The city around it was not. By the early 19th century, London was becoming one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Its cesspits overflowed. Its drains emptied into waterways, and the Thames received enormous quantities of human waste while simultaneously serving as a source of water for the people living beside it. Then, People started dying. In 1831 and 1832, cholera swept through Britain. Another major outbreak came in 1848 and 1849, then another in 1853 and 1854. The disease was terrifying. A healthy person could develop severe diarrhea and vomiting, lose enormous amounts of fluid, become dangerously dehydrated, and die with shocking speed. Entire families could be devastated. Thousands died, and almost nobody understood why. The dominant medical theory blamed miasma, bad air. Doctors, politicians, and ordinary citizens believed that foul smells carried disease. The idea seemed reasonable. The filthiest neighborhoods often smelled terrible, and those neighborhoods were frequently hit hardest by epidemics. They had correctly identified a relationship between sewage and disease. They had simply misunderstood how the disease traveled. Then a London doctor named John Snow began looking at the problem differently. During a cholera outbreak in Soho in 1854, Snow mapped where victims had lived. A pattern appeared. Cases clustered around a public water pump on Broad Street. Snow suspected contaminated water. He gathered evidence from residents and compared households using different water sources. Eventually, the handle of the Broad Street pump was removed. The outbreak subsided. The famous pump did not single-handedly prove germ theory, and many officials remained unconvinced by Snow's explanation. But he had moved public health toward a revolutionary idea. The danger was not simply what people smelled, it was what they swallowed. Human waste was contaminating drinking water, and a toilet was only truly safe if the waste leaving it remained separated from the water people drank. That sounds obvious now. It was not obvious then. 4 years later, London received a lesson it could smell. The summer of 1858 became unusually hot. The Thames was already carrying staggering quantities of sewage. As the water level fell and temperatures rose, waste along the banks began decomposing in the heat. The smell invaded central London. It entered homes. It filled offices. And most importantly, it entered Parliament. Politicians who had tolerated decades of sanitation problems suddenly found themselves sitting beside the source. The crisis became known as the Great Stink, and the response was remarkably fast. Parliament approved funding for a massive new sewer system. The man given the job of helping rescue London was engineer Joseph Bazalgette. His plan was enormous. Instead of allowing thousands of local drains to dump directly into the Thames in central London, Bazalgette designed a network of intercepting sewers that collected the waste and carried it farther downstream. Miles of underground brick tunnels were constructed. Pumping stations moved sewage where gravity could not. Embankments transformed parts of the riverfront while hiding major sewer lines beneath them. London was essentially building another city underneath the city, and the effect was profound. The sewers were built because people believed removing foul-smelling waste would eliminate dangerous air. Their science was incomplete. Their engineering still worked. By separating sewage from drinking water sources and densely populated neighborhoods, the system dramatically reduced opportunities for waterborne disease to spread. London suffered another cholera outbreak in 1866, but it struck an area that had not yet been fully connected to the new sewer network. The pattern helped strengthen the case that contaminated water, not simply bad air, was responsible. A city had accidentally built part of the correct solution for the wrong scientific reason. And the lesson traveled. Growing cities across Europe and North America began investing heavily in sewer systems, clean water infrastructure, drainage, and municipal sanitation. The toilet was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was becoming the visible end of an invisible network. But one famous name still had to enter the story: Thomas Crapper. You have probably heard some version of the claim that Thomas Crapper invented the toilet. He did not. Flushing toilets existed long before he was born. But Crapper was a successful Victorian plumber and sanitation businessman who manufactured and promoted bathroom fixtures, held patents related to plumbing equipment, and helped make sanitary technology more visible and commercially successful. His company displayed bathroom fixtures in showrooms where customers could actually see and choose them. That mattered. The toilet was transforming from an awkward mechanical device hidden away in wealthy homes into a standardized consumer product. Plumbing improved. Ceramic manufacturing improved. Municipal water supplies expanded. Sewer connections spread. And bathrooms began moving inside ordinary homes. That transition changed daily life more than it might seem. For most of history, going to the toilet meant leaving the house, using a shared facility, dealing with a chamber pot, or living directly beside the smell and danger of human waste. Modern plumbing created distance. You pushed a lever, water arrived instantly, waste disappeared through a pipe, and an enormous infrastructure system took responsibility from there. That convenience was so effective that people gradually stopped thinking about what happened next, which is exactly why the modern toilet can be misleading. The porcelain bowl is not the life-saving invention by itself. The system is. A safe toilet has to contain waste. That waste has to be moved or stored without contaminating people and water. It has to be treated, and only then can it be safely returned to the environment. A beautiful flushing toilet connected to a pipe that empties into a river beside someone's drinking water is not safe sanitation. Victorian London learned that the hard way. Many parts of the world are still dealing with the same fundamental problem. As cities expanded through the 19th and 20th centuries, sanitation became one of the defining projects of modern government. Engineers built treatment plants. Cities separated drinking water systems from sewage networks. Public health departments monitored outbreaks. Building codes required plumbing. Bathrooms became expected features of housing, and diseases that had once terrorized major cities became far less common in places with reliable water and sanitation systems. Cholera did not disappear from the world, but it increasingly became a disease associated with places where safe water and sanitation had broken down or never been adequately built. War zones, refugee camps, flooded communities, overcrowded settlements, places where sewage and drinking water can meet. That distinction is important because it reveals what the toilet actually accomplished. It did not defeat disease through some magical property of porcelain and water. It created a physical barrier between human beings and human waste, and that barrier is one of the foundations of modern public health. The transformation also changed privacy. For much of history, toilets were communal, shared, exposed, or located outside the home. The private bathroom created an entirely different relationship with the human body. Something once performed beside strangers in Roman latrines became one of the most private activities in modern life. The toilet changed architecture. It changed plumbing. It changed how cities used water. It changed where houses were built. It changed expectations about dignity. And eventually it became so normal that its absence became almost unimaginable to people in wealthy countries. But globally, the sanitation revolution is not finished. Even today, billions of people still lack safely managed sanitation. Hundreds of millions still practice open defecation, and inadequate water, sanitation, and hygiene remain connected to enormous numbers of preventable deaths every year. That means the history of the toilet is not simply a story about how humanity solved a disgusting problem in the past. It is a story about a problem we are still solving. And there is another complication. The classic flushing toilet consumes water. A lot of it. Older designs could use several gallons with every flush. Modern, high-efficiency toilets use far less, but when billions of flushes happen every day, the total demand remains enormous. In places facing drought, water scarcity, failing infrastructure, or rapidly growing populations, the assumption that every toilet should use drinking quality water to transport waste through miles of pipe is increasingly being questioned. Engineers are experimenting with low-water toilets, vacuum systems, composting toilets, urine-diverting designs, decentralized treatment, and systems that recover nutrients and energy from human waste, which creates a strange possibility. The toilet of the future may look less like the Victorian flush toilet than we expect. For most of the 20th century, the goal was simple: make waste disappear. Now engineers increasingly ask a different question. Disappear to where? Human waste contains water, nitrogen, phosphorus, organic matter, and potential energy. For thousands of years, societies treated some of it as fertilizer. Modern sanitation made enormous progress by separating waste from people, but often turned that waste into something cities simply wanted to dispose of as quickly as possible. The next sanitation revolution may involve treating it as a resource again, while keeping the disease protection that modern systems created. And that brings the story into an unexpected circle. Ancient farmers needed to manage waste. Roman engineers needed to move it. Medieval cities needed people to collect it. Victorian engineers needed to keep it out of drinking water. Modern engineers now need to do all of those things while using less water, recovering resources, and serving billions of people who still lack safe sanitation. The technology changed. The fundamental problem did not. Human beings produce waste every day. Civilization depends on separating that waste from the places where we eat, drink, sleep, and live. That is the real history hiding inside the toilet. Not the story of one inventor, not the story of one porcelain bowl. It is the story of humanity slowly learning that cities cannot survive unless they manage the things people would rather not talk about. Thousands of years ago, people built clay drains beneath early settlements. The Romans constructed communal latrines and enormous sewers. Medieval workers climbed into cesspits. An Elizabethan courtier experimented with flushing. Inventors bent pipes to trap sewer gases. A London doctor followed cholera deaths back toward contaminated water. An engineer buried miles of sewers beneath one of the world's largest cities. And generations of plumbers, builders, public health workers, sanitation workers, chemists, and engineers turned those ideas into systems used by billions of people. All so that you can press one button and forget about the entire process. And maybe that is the toilet's greatest achievement. When sanitation works perfectly, you barely notice it exists. There is no epidemic, no overflowing cesspit, no contaminated well, no river of sewage outside your front door. You flush, you wash your hands, and you walk away. But remove that invisible system for even a short period of time, and one of the basic vulnerabilities of human civilization comes rushing back. Today, inadequate water, sanitation, and hygiene still contribute to more than 1 million preventable deaths each year worldwide. So the next time you walk into a bathroom and see that ordinary porcelain object sitting against the wall, remember what you are actually looking at. Not just a toilet, a connection to thousands of years of engineering, a piece of an underground infrastructure system larger than most people will ever see, a barrier between drinking water and disease, an invention that helped make the modern city possible, and one of the most overlooked life-saving technologies human beings have ever built. Not bad for something we spend most of our lives trying not to talk about. If this story changed the way you look at one of the most ordinary objects in your home, subscribe for more hidden histories behind the things we use every day. And drop a comment telling us which everyday object we should uncover next.